to them, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from men. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done and the toil I had spent in doing it. And again, all was vanity and a chasing after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. Not that I am referring to being in need, for I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well fed, and of going hungry, of having plenty, and of being in need. May God add blessing to the reading, hearing, and living of this holy word this day.
Thanks be to God.
So, just a moment before I get started, I just want to remind you that in your bulletin, again this week, you have week 3 of some questions that you might want to ask and think about this week, and then a prayer that you could certainly use during your weekly prayer time, daily prayer time this week. Hopefully, if you have any questions or you have any comments that you want to share with me, you can certainly email me. My email address is on the bulletin. And if you want to have a conversation, we can do that via email or in person, whatever works for you. I left the back blank. If you want to make notes from something that I might say today that you want to remember, you can do that on that. Also, at the end of worship today, I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, but I'll remind you that this 4 weeks of talking about generosity and simplicity and gratefulness will culminate next week in my last sermon, and that's also the Sunday that I'm going to be asking you to make a generosity commitment to the church. And that's the commitment that you'll make for giving of your time, talents, presence, gifts, and service and witness in 2019. And so as you leave today, ushers will give you one of these cards. This is the commitment card, the generosity commitment card. And I want to ask you to take this home and think about it and pray about it, and then bring it back with you next week, because we'll be collecting these next week. Just know that if you forget to bring your card next week, not to worry, we will have more cards next week. So, dog can't eat your homework, folks. We'll have cards for you next week, too. So, it's been in the news this week, those devastating fires in California, and this is not the first time, of course, that these kinds of things have come across the news to us. It happens a lot, it seems, around the world and in our country, especially if it's a flood or a rainstorm that doesn't go away, or snow or fire in the case of California. Natural disasters seem to be ever present in the news. And when these kinds of things happen, they always go and talk with folks who have been affected by these kinds of things. And oftentimes news people will ask folks how they're doing or how they're feeling or whatever. And more often than not, I've noticed people whose houses have burned to the ground, or people whose houses have been flooded away, in many senses are very grateful, not because their house is burned down or floated away, but because their family is safe. And the things that are most important to them, like their life, is what they've been left with. And so even in the midst of this great tragedy, they've found a way to understand that they need to be grateful for the safety that has been enjoyed by many of them. Amen. It causes us, and we haven't been a part of that here in Tucson lately, that I know of anyway, but I wanted us to think about that what would you do if this were to happen to you? They took a survey, Time Magazine did, online, and they asked people, if you only had moments to escape, what would you save? One person took their pillow, another person saved family pictures, someone else saved the saxophone they had been learning to play, someone else saved their cats and important documents, and I suppose we could put dogs in there too, we don't want to leave out dog folk. One woman saved her Bible, her purse, her shoes, and her cell phone. Now, we can laugh at this, but I'm going to ask you to think about just for a moment. If you only had moments to grab things and get out of harm's way, what would you take? And let's say that you could only take whatever you can carry in your arms. One trip into your house. What would you gather to take with you if you knew that probably everything else would be destroyed? What would you take with you? Anyone want to volunteer an answer? Computer. Your computer? Safe? What would you take?
Pictures.
Pictures? I heard something over here.
Camera. John, go.
Camera. What did you say, Brad?
Camera.
A camera. Joe?
I'd make sure my wife was okay. 2 dogs.
Okay. No, yeah. Thanks, Joe. The rest of you men out there and wives. I'm not sure you thought about the spouse first, but you might want to put that right up at the top of the list. Precious cargo would be, yeah. And let's make sure we get these in the right order of priority. But this is the point. Natural disasters like this should serve as a reminder to us that everything in our world is temporary. Everything is temporary. And one of the scriptures that was read to you this morning says exactly that. It said, life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. We've been talking about this now. This is the 3rd week, and we've been talking about how it is that possessions begin to take possessions of us. And we know, we read scripture, I think we say we believe what the scripture says when it says that we should live lives of simplicity. And it says lives do not consist in the abundance of possessions. We say we believe that, but we have a world who's telling us that that's not true. We have a world that tells us that everything is dependent upon how much we have, our status, who we are, and how much we think of ourselves. And so it's really hard when we're getting these mixed messages. One from our faith that tells us this is what we should believe, and this is how we should live, and another from the world that says, no, you need to have more stuff. But despite that, we do have Jesus' words to tell us that the things of life are temporary and that the most important things that we have are not the possessions that we own. A couple of weeks we talked about that there's a couple of diseases that we're afflicted with. One was affluenza and one was credititis. And I told you the symptoms of those. I hope nobody has gotten those or that you're working on getting those cured if those happen to happen to you. But I have another dangerous condition that I want to talk about today, and that's called the restless heart syndrome. And what the symptom of this restless heart syndrome is discontent. So, what happens is when we have RHS, or restless heart syndrome, we become dissatisfied quickly and oftentimes with almost everything. Because what happens with restless heart syndrome is that the moment that we acquire something, we scarcely take time to enjoy it and want to move on to the next thing, because it seems as if the acquiring of the thing is the thing that drives us the most. And once we have that, then we move on and we want to have the next thing. And this is the nature of restless heart syndrome, and it can be fatal and destroy us if we leave it unchecked. Now, I do want to say that there is an aside that we need to be aware of, and that is that God has put certain discontent into us. God actually has wired our hearts so that we would be discontent with certain things that cause us to seek out God in our lives and to strive for being a better person, let's say. But the problem is that we humans get the things that we should be contented with and the things that we should be discontented with mixed up. And so we become content with the things that we shouldn't and discontented with the things that we shouldn't, instead of the other way around. And so we find ourselves constantly in this state of turmoil, trying to feed this restless heart syndrome with more things. There was a Scottish philosopher and politician in the late 1870s. If you'll also notice, a lot of the things that I've referenced have gone back into the 1800s. that gives us words of wisdom. He said this, he said, "It is right to be contented with what we have, but never with what we are." It is right to be contented with what we have, but never with what we are. Now, this is how this works. It means that we should be contented with stuff, but that our spiritual growth, our character, and the things that we do and give and love and those kinds of things, we should always be achieving, trying to achieve a better self.
Amen.
We're meant to know God more fully. We should be discontent with how we know God and want to cultivate a deeper prayer life. That we want to not be content with the way that justice works in our country or in our world, and be discontent with that, so that we seek out justice, and we seek out holiness, and that we seek out love, and to love others more deeply. Those are the things that God has placed in us that we should be discontent with, so that we become and strive to be better persons. The problem is that we tend to be comfortable with our level of righteousness, and that becomes self-righteousness, in case you're interested. And we become content with how we love others. I don't hate people, but, do you love people? That's the question. We become content in our relationship to God, and we leave our spiritual growth behind as we pursue other things. And oftentimes, we're simply content with how much time we spend in prayer, saying, well, I do pray once in a while, and that's good enough. But these things are not the things that we should be content with. And so the things that we need and want in our lives, the growth of personal nature, sometimes we find ourselves contented with that, and we cease to grow and do spiritual things and live lives of love that we're called to do. We oftentimes experience discontent with our possessions, and this is what gets us to this restless heart syndrome. We're discontent with our homes or cars or televisions or gadgets or clothes or whatever else, our position or whatever. And we want bigger and more modern and the latest thing. At one time or another, maybe you've been discontent with jobs. And sometimes this is for people a big deal, and they spend their whole careers going from one job to another, trying to find that job that will fulfill them, thinking that, well, this boss of mine is not nice, or I didn't get the thing that I wanted, or I don't like my coworkers, and so discontent begins to build, and so they never are able to find that place, that work that fulfills them. And unfortunately, this sometimes happens when it comes to church. There's the illusion out there that church is going to be perfect. It's a big illusion, because we all are imperfect people, and church is going to be not perfect. But when we come to church, we meet nice people, and we say, oh, this feels like a good church, and then pretty soon we start to notice the little things that get to us, like, that usher wasn't all that friendly to me this morning. Or that pastor said something, I didn't really like that. Or I volunteered to do that thing, and they never called me. And before long, all you see in the church is what's wrong with the church. You can't see the good stuff anymore. And so you know what happens? People go and they start shopping for another church, thinking that they're going to find the perfect church someplace else. But if you've done that, you know that that's not going to happen. Have you ever, when you were a kid, were you ever dissatisfied or discontented with your parents? Didn't you wish that the neighbor kids' parents were your parents? Because they were the ones that let you do all the fun stuff? We were discontent with the wrong things. People also get discontented with their marriages. In the beginning, it's all hearts and roses and flowers and things. But then they begin to see those small things that irritate them and frustrate them and drive them crazy, and suddenly there's no good there, that they can't see anything good in their partner. Now, I'm not saying that you should, that marriages don't go bad and there needs to be a dissolving of those. I'm just saying that when we become discontent in the smallest of ways, we forget all of the good things that are there.
Amen.
So what can we do about our restless heart syndrome? Well, I think we need to look at how we can cultivate contentment in our lives. And contentment and simplicity go hand in hand. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those things. Because I believe that if we simplify, we can be more content. And that when we are content, we can simplify. And the Apostle Paul is a perfect example of contentment. He said this, he said, I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. In any circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well fed and of going hungry, of having plenty and of being in need. And we need to remind ourselves that Paul was sitting in prison when he wrote those words. So like Paul, if we really try, we can learn to be content with whatever circumstances we find ourselves in. So the first key to cultivating contentment might be to remember things could be worse. And this is a practical way of looking for the bright side of things, to find that thing that you can hold on to, even in the worst of situations, that might be something that will bring you that bit of hope, that bit of understanding that, you know what, it could be worse. And maybe the next thing that we could do to cultivate contentment would be to ask yourself, how long will this thing make me happy? I think we think that we're going to be satisfied when we make that purchase, that thing. And I think oftentimes what happens is that as soon as we get the box open, we move on to the next thing because our contentment doesn't last as long as we thought. And perhaps another key to cultivating contentment would be to develop a grateful heart, like I shared with you in the prayer time today. Gratitude as an essential part of being content. Because when you're grateful, you recognize that life is a gift. And that in and of itself should fill us with gratitude. So much gratitude that we should be able to be content. Contentment comes when we spend time giving thanks for what we have been given, rather than thinking about what we want to have next. So we can focus on the things that we don't have or don't like, or we can begin to search out the things that we do like and can be grateful for, and contentedness comes from that. Another key to cultivating contentment is to ask yourself, where does my soul find satisfaction? Now, this might be a tougher one because this asks us to go deep within, to really evaluate our hearts. Paul, the apostle, found contentment, and he found where his soul was fed the most and where he got his satisfaction. And he said that when he said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. The apostle Paul understood that in his deep love of God through Jesus Christ, he was able to be strengthened. He would have everything that his soul needed to be content. All of Paul's deepest desires could be satisfied in the relationship that he had with God through Christ. We can do the same thing. We can have that same contentment if we'll look at how we can be more connected to our God, to our Creator. And we can be more content if we believe that our lives have meaning just as they are, and that possessions don't bring meaning. And we can know contentment and know fulfillment of our spirits if we understand that God's grace and God's mercy are there no matter what when we mess up. And that our life is not diminished by the mistakes that we make, but that our life is increased in God's grace and mercy. And we can have contentment if we begin to realize more fully that there is hope for us in the darkest of places because God's Spirit and God is there with us. And I believe that we can develop contentment when we come to understand that God loves us unconditionally and that God knows us better than we know ourselves. And I think we can bring contentment when we are able to share meaningful relationships and love with one another. That's why Jesus said, that the two most important things are to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. You see, that's what brings the heart contentment. But we live in a world that says that that's not so. We live in a world that tells us that in order to be satisfied, you need to go to the mall. That's where satisfaction comes from. Solomon, in the scripture that was read to you this morning, Solomon realized just how much time he wasted. And let me just share Solomon's words once again with you. He said this, and he wrote this in the later years of his life. You know, how when we get older, we tend to reflect. At least I hope we tend to reflect. And Solomon wrote this. He said, "Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure. And then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had spent in doing it. And again, all was vanity and a chasing after wind." You all know you cannot catch the wind, right? And that everything that we pursue that doesn't bring anything good into our lives or someone else's life is like chasing and trying to catch the wind. It is all for nothing. I like it when he says it's all vanity, because you see, that's really what it is. It's our own vainness that gets us to the idea that we have to have more things in order to be valuable. And we can learn to be content when we learn to live more simply. And if you want to simplify your life, there's a whole lot of people and books and websites and all sorts of stuff out there that can tell you how to simplify your life. Now, this takes some work, and it takes some dedication, and it takes some willpower to do. And I've been working on this myself lately, trying to get rid of the things that I've got boxes of things that I've been moving from place to place for the last 17, 18 years. It's precious to me. You know what that is? No, it's just precious. I've not had it out of the box in 17 years. How precious can it be? Huh? How much value does it really have? And I tell you, most of it's books, because I'm a book person. But I'm learning that carrying those books around in boxes and never opening those boxes up doesn't get me anything except a stack of boxes in a room, gathering dust. At some point, we need to say to ourselves, enough is enough. Collecting more things won't make me more happy. Collecting more things won't make me be more fulfilled. Collecting more things won't give me the personality that I wish I had. Collecting more things won't give me a better relationship with God. Only the things that matter most, the things that feed my spirit and my soul, will do those things. So if you want to simplify your life, then reduce your consumption. You might want to, this is a hard one, but take those bags to the grocery store instead of getting the plastic ones. When you eat out and you grab a handful of paper napkins, how many of you do that? Don't grab a handful of napkins, just take one or two, because the rest of those usually end up in the garbage. Turn the thermostat down a couple of degrees and put on a sweater if you get too cool. I'm not going to mention any names. Before you purchase something, ask yourself, do I really need this, or do I just want it? This will force you to think about the motivation for why you're making that purchase. And you may find yourself wrestling with what your true motive is if you're honest. And sometimes you might even decide that your motivation for purchasing that item is not a good one. It's kind of like I said a week or so ago, wait 24 hours. And if you still think you need it and have to have it, then maybe that's something that you should get. And one of the things that they say in simplifying your life is use stuff up before you get something new. How many times do we throw things away just because we get tired of them? If nothing else, donate them and let someone else get some use out of them. We do that with appliances. Nowadays they don't fix things, like they used to. You could take your television or your toaster or whatever it was down to the guy and he would fix it. You didn't throw it away and buy a new one. But nowadays we throw things away before they have lived out their lives because we just get tired of the color. What's that about? And maybe we need to think about how much money, I talked about this last week, and so I'm not going to harp on it, how much money we spend out and about. Maybe stay home. Enjoy one another's company. Play a board game. Play charades. Do something that gets you more acquainted with your loved ones. And then ask yourself, are there some major changes that I could make in my life to allow me to simplify? And this is a bigger thing, so you might not want to start with this one. But it's thinking about, if you're living in a home that's now too big for just one or two of you, maybe it's time to think about downsizing. When you have less, see, this is the way I look at it. The less room you have, the less shelves you have, the less you have to dust. It's as simple as that. I'm all about not dusting more. So if I have less space, there's less places to dust. Less spaces to collect things. We talked about this last week. The more stuff we have, the more places we need to put it, and then we go out and rent space to put our stuff in. How silly is that? Learning to live with less makes our lives less stressful. We have less maintenance, less upkeep, less everything when we have less in our lives. Maybe there's a club membership you don't use. You don't have to admit it, that's all right. But maybe you could find something more useful to spend that money on. And remember, when we are doing things that are a waste of our time, a waste of our talent, and a waste of our money, we're not able to concentrate and do the things that God calls us to do. How can we feed the poor? How can we house the homeless? How can we care for the widow and the orphan? How can we do all of those things if we're so busy pursuing more stuff in our lives that doesn't bring us any kind of satisfaction? We cannot do the things that God calls us to do. So ask yourself these questions. What are the long-term consequences of what it is I'm about to do or buy? Is there a higher good or a better outcome if I use my resource of time or money or energy in another way? And will this thing that I do or buy honor God? When we stop to ask ourselves these three questions, I think we begin to move beyond the idea that we need to have more things. Someone said, I read that, acquiring more stuff is a form of slavery because we have to work more to get more stuff, and so we're enslaved by our stuff. And I don't believe that that's what God wants for our lives. I think when we choose contentment, it means that we choose to have what's necessary in our lives. I don't believe God wants us to go without the necessities of life. But I do think that we have to decide to live more simple lives, to waste less, to conserve more, and to be generous in our giving. And I think that if we do those things, that we can reclaim the joy of contentment and simplicity in our lives. I've heard lots of stories from folks that are older about how much simpler life was back then. And there is something to that. Because the things that mattered most were the things that brought a family closer together or provided for the needs of a family. And it wasn't just stuff that looked pretty or made us feel good about ourselves. Let us learn to be joyful, to be content, and to live more simply. Remember those words. 'Tis a gift to be simple, 'tis a gift to be free.